When we're making landscape, the first thing we need to do, aside from actually creating it, is to get the broad hill forms in. Ground is very rarely perfectly flat, and so we always have a little bit of curve in there, a little bit of hill and volume change to deal with. What I'm going to do is go into my landscape palette and start to sculpt my landscape a little bit. Right now it's a flat grid, and those are just light bake artifacts we're seeing. What I'll do is to go into my sculpting here in the landscape editor. We've got manage, where we actually manage that landscape and select components. Sculpting, where we're changing the height map actually, moving around that landscape, and painting if we do want to paint in additional materials. I'll go into sculpt, and as you can see in here, we've got under the sculpt tool a lot of different things available. Sculpting, smoothing, flattening, even erosion and hydroerosion, and noise, retopologizing if needed, if the mesh is a little bit, well, wonky after some sculpting, and so forth. We've got a lot of great things in here. And what we can also do is choose our brush. So we click on Sculpt, and in here we've got our circle brush. A standard circle brush with a nice smooth fall off or a very hard one. Or we can sculpt by an alpha and print things in, or work with a pattern or component. We can also deal with different fall offs in here. Is it smooth? Is it linear to make mesas? Are we dealing in spherical or tips, and so forth? I'm going to work with a circle smooth at the moment. And in here, I'm going to make my brush size nice and big. We can see our brush here, defined by those two circles. The fall off then is that zone between the inside and outside. If we take the brush fall off higher, we can see that there's the effect in the middle, pulling it up, and a nice smooth fall off on the outside. If we deal with it the other way, pulling that fall off down, we get very hard shapes. What I'm going to do is pull up that fall off fairly nicely, maybe into the 0.6 range, give or take, and take this tool strength down a little bit. I want to build up some low rolling hills around my road. I'll open up my viewport just a little bit by dragging open these palettes. And what I'm going to do is start away from the road and start to build up some low hills. I'll pull these up. We can always erase if we need and push these back down. What I'm doing is bringing up some low, rolling hills around. Even a couple layers of them, making sure I don't make giant hills or pimples, but instead, low rolling topography. It's meant to be a backdrop, not necessarily the foreground point of interest. I see some places to erase later, but I'm not overly worried about it. We can always undo if we need and take out strokes, and I'll pull these into place. What I'm looking for also is camouflage of that horizon. When we get down here at our player level, and I'll zip around and select part of my building and frame in, what we're going to see is that as long as it's not symmetric, we'll feel, well, like this is fairly natural, and there's a place I need to erase. For example, we've got some low rolling hills across the street, and I do need to push them back down to smooth them in. But definitely from the balcony, or rather from the front porch here, we feel like, well, it's okay that horizon is camouflaged. We're just seeing low hills. I'll sculpt them in a little more, working my way around this curved road. I'll deal with some erasing in a minute, but first I'll bring up these hills and really get them into shape. I'm staying deliberately away from my building so that I don't accidentally bring a floor right up through, or rather a hill right up through the floor. Now I'll hold Shift and push them down. So Shift inverts that function, and I'll push these back in, making sure I'm not catching that sidewalk, taking out the hill that took over the front step for a minute, and pushing them into place. If it helps, you can also switch over to unlit, for example, or even a wireframe. We can work in detail lighting if it's easier to see, or whatever mode really works for you. I'll keep it in lit, and I'm going to just push these down a little bit more. Next, I'll use my smooth brush, switching from sculpting over to smoothing to take out any large artifacts or pieces introduced in. I'll smooth out my hills a little bit, and then maybe even flatten them, introducing a couple of places of more flatter topography. So it's not that melted ice cream look all over the place. We want a little bit of difference in our hills. I'll go back and forth between smoothing, flattening, and sculpting in here, getting the overall look in place. I'll erase it away from the road, and when that's done, I'm ready to get in and do a little more fine detail. The theme here is to block it out and then refine. Right here, my brush is entirely too coarse to get up next to the sidewalk. So what I'll do is take that brush size way down. So now, when I start to bring up some micro hills, we'll call them, some little bits of, well, topography next to that sidewalk, we get a refinement of detail. And I'll let this even start to become, we'll call it ridges on this major hill. The trick is really brush it in and then refine, making sure that very carefully you're adding in little bits of detail where you'll see it, and keeping away from detail in places you won't. I'll bring it up all around the sidewalk. This may take a little bit of time. It's better to layer it in than it is to try to do it all at once. I'll bring up my brush strength just a little bit and just pull it up next to it. I'm deliberately working with a smaller brush here, making sure that I'm not adding obvious bumps on here. In fact, that went a little too big. So the trick is to do some sculpting in here and stay away from the obvious. This will also help add interest. As the light plays on this surface, we find it more believable, the more variety there is. So a little bit of work to pull this up really does the trick. I'm okay if I have a tiniest bit of lap over the sidewalk. Just a little bit once in a while, although I can always push it back down. But it gets a little more believable. The one thing you may notice with landscape is this, that at some point we're dealing in, well, grid squares. And so if those really clip into a hard surface like the sidewalk, you'll get some odd edges. So I'm going to bring it up fairly close, but not right onto it. And I'll always take these lines and sculpt them up the hill. Remember, landscapes evolve. They have erosion patterns, there's plate tectonics, there's all kinds of things at place, even bulldozers. And so we want to think of, gee, when this was natural, what did it look like? And then, as it evolved and was eroded and so forth, what happened to it? Now I'll take my smoothing brush, and again, I'm going to bring up that size a touch and just sort of run over things, making sure that that strength is not too high. I'll check it out, hitting play. I realize that my lighting needs to be baked, but the neat part is when I look across the hill, or even press W and go forward, we get the idea of some low rolling hills with some minor bumps on them, that there's some variety to that landscape. If it looks like an ocean of my street here, it's because of that lighting not being built, but that's okay. What I'm really after is the camouflage, that when we look both ways here, we do feel that, well, gee, there's just more landscape there if only we could get to it. And I'm going to block the player from moving about past here. So as long as it looks like we can't see a flat horizon, we're in good shape. I'll do a little bit more sculpting on that side. Just looks like it's a little bit flat. And then I've got some low rolling hills across from my building. And they're deliberately asymmetric, so there's no twinning in pieces that should be, well, unique. I'll go back to my sculpting tool one more time. Dolly back out, and I'm going to bring up this landscape in any place obvious, like right here next to that sidewalk. I'll just bump this up a touch. This way I don't get any obvious shadow artifacts, and it's okay if it sort of hills right into it right here. What I'm after again is camouflage, making sure that, well, of course the landscape looks like kind of so what low rolling hills, and more importantly, why should I believe that they're anything else? We're after the obviously right here. The idea that what we see is, well, natural, and there's nothing in there that makes us question what's going on. It just happens to be, well, things we've seen a million times, we write them off as looking just fine, and we're good. And that's the real trick. It's not that this is obviously right from an aerial view. It's a little weird looking. But from our player's point of view, there's hills. When we go outside, well, those hills just wrap around our view, and it looks like, well, gee, our world exists all around us, even though we've blocked the endless nothing beyond.